So once again, we look at the larger mission of this course to really give us a sense. We look back in history in order to understand what we can and must do in our careers. Um, One of the really important reference points for this lecture is Hannah Arendt's writing in around the time of the Eichmann trials. After World War II, we caught a Nazi and put him on trial in The Hague, and Hannah Arendt famously wrote about the nature of warfare, the nature of evil. And she came up with this term called the banality of evil. In the movies, evil is part of a grand big scheme. For some reason, someone didn't get enough love as a child, or for whatever. They develop evil plots, and there are super villains and there are superheroes who defeat those super villains. In real life, Hannah Arendt portrayal is more common. Rarely do we have supervillains like Hitler. More often, we have people who look the other way. And it's the looking the other way that is really ultimately the cause of harm in humanity. And Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil. Banality is the opposite of spectacular. And so it's the neglect of normal bureaucratic operation of systems. And this is in close relationship to the reading we had for today, which is simultaneously at the core of urban studies and also part of the foundation of the global movement towards socialism. Right? Friedrich Engels, if you read the editor's introduction, we're told that Friedrich Engels, at the age of 24, his father said, "Time to get to work, young man. Why don't you become an overseer in my factory in Manchester, England, the largest industrial city in the world at the time?" And so he did, and a weird thing happened. He defied his class. He became a traitor to his class. The understanding is the wealthy takes care of its own. The children of wealth take care of their wealthy class, and they don't make trouble. For some reason, by some fluke, he looked at the working conditions in Manchester, England, and he looked at the living conditions of the workers in the factory where he was an overseer, and he was disturbed by it. And just like when we see homelessness on the street, we either turn away and walk as far away as we can from the homeless person, 9 times out of 10. Or the exceptional thing is you walk right up to the person and engage them in conversation as if they had dignity and they were an actual human being, and maybe you give them $1 or two. And young Freddie did the latter. And he did more than that. He actually had the courage to walk through all of the dangerous slums, dirty slum areas of Manchester, and then the further audacity at the age of 24 to write extensively about it and publish about these horrible conditions. And so he defied the banality of evil in this act of writing. And at the age of 24, he became a collaborator with an older gentleman named Karl Marx. And we know about Marx because he's supposed to be the arch enemy of capitalism and the father of Marxism. And we're supposed to hate Marxism because it's the ideological framework for places like Cuba and Venezuela, which have been horrific places of human suffering, especially Venezuela lately. But Karl Marx was not just the poster the figurehead of this powerful ideology that caused so much harm globally, he was also a social scientist. And so we need to set aside the evils of Marxism and instead look at Marxian, which is a very different thing, Marxian critical thinking and critical analysis. So Marxian critical analysis is at the core of the social sciences today. And it's very distinct from Marxist ideology that causes so much harm and suffering around the world. And so this can be confusing as you navigate political ideologies and academia as you move forward. But I'm making this distinction so that we can understand that our analysis work that we've been doing all semester really is an outgrowth of Marxian critical thinking. We look at the world and attempt to overcome the momentum of history by truly seeing the conditions of the world around us. And we identify things that cause human suffering and harm, and we point them out in our analysis. So we've been doing this all semester, and this is just another attempt to give clarity to what it is we do. And this is at the heart of what is most important about a professional education. Every architect, whether you're licensed or not, there is an ethical obligation, and at the core of the ethics of architecture is empathy. And at the beginning of design thinking, I don't know if have we talked about design thinking? Has anyone talked about design thinking as a methodology? Well, it's left home in the design professions and it's moved into business schools. So if you go to Stanford Business School, at Stanford, they decided that they didn't want to be the B school anymore. They said, stop calling us the B school. Call us the D school. And the D stands for design. Because they said design thinking is the methodology of problem solving for the 21st century. And design thinking, as theorized by Dan Brown? I can't remember. But in some course you'll take at some point, it's likely to be a reading. It's about design thinking. The faculty here loves to teach this in their courses. I'm just referring to it, drop a flag, look into it over spring break or over the summer or 20 years from now. But design thinking, you will encounter this again. Design thinking is a method of looking at the world, figuring out what's going on, and then designing action to address it. And step one in design thinking is empathy for the users. This is the basis for user experience design. You may have heard of that in interactive media design processes. And so the first step of design thinking is empathy. At the core of the ethical obligations of architectural practice is empathy for the client and stakeholder groups. And often our stakeholder groups are not our clients. They're not the ones officially paying our commissions. But we are ethically obligated to consider the perspectives and the outcomes of our design processes for all users. And so with that in mind, and this has been true all semester in every topic we look at, it's just that this topic gives us the opportunity to look at that more specifically. And at the same time, we're looking at how cities do what they do and what do cities do. So what do cities do and how do they do it? The first part of that, we're going back in history through the centuries, and we're about to take 4 big leaps in history. This big leap takes us to the year 1500, actually 1492, What happened in 1492? Columbus, right? So you've studied this topic before. You studied all about Christopher Columbus and the explorers, and the way you probably studied it is that Europeans, because they had technology, were able to go out and discover the full extent of the world and bring civilization to the brown-skinned people of the South. But there's more to it than that. We're going to look at what Spain did. So the Spanish and the Portuguese operated in a very specific manner. They had a royal system. And what they did, and the Portuguese were the first. Who knew? But this tiny, tiny little country in Europe developed navigational skills that they derived from Islam, the great libraries of Islam, where they discovered that the world was round. Who knew? Well, the Muslim scholars knew. While Europe was in the Dark Ages, Islam was the academic, scholarly powerhouse of the world. They had the greatest libraries in the world. And the only reason we know about things like Greek philosophy, the Bible, etc., the only reason we know anything about that is because it was all preserved in the great libraries of the Islamic world. Thank you very much. And as we emerged, as the Europeans, which is odd, as Europe emerged from the Dark Ages, it increasingly had access to knowledge that had been preserved. Also, the Chinese inventions of sail shapes and the compass, all of these things came together in Portugal. And Portugal set out across the Atlantic, discovered the Azores, the Canary Islands, Cape Verde, and then down through the west coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and then across the Indian Ocean. And their job was to find where were all these spices coming from. Right? All these spices and silk were showing up from Constantinople and Cairo, from points further east, and they were coming into Venice. Venice was becoming stupidly wealthy, right? And as those spices and silks and other things were spreading through Europe, at every point the price goes up and up and up. And the goal for hundreds and hundreds of years, let's cut out the middleman, all those Muslim traders. Why should they be getting wealthy when we can shortcut with our new sailing technology? Let's get the spices, let's get the silks, let's get the china, the porcelain. Let's get those things right at their source and buy it for 1 cent and sell it for $100. Instead of it going up incrementally every time it changed hands, let's just do it in one journey. And so the Portuguese and the Spanish, and there's way too many slides here, so I'm going to skip a few. So the yellow shows what Columbus thought. The Portuguese did a much better job than this Italian guy, Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus thought this is where China was. And so he set sail, and he said, okay, let's go to China. But instead of encountering China in yellow, he encountered the New World, the Caribbean instead. So he was more of an evangelist. He was doing this for God. And this was a big part of the motivation of the Portuguese and the Spanish, was we have to bring God to the rest of the world and bring back silver and gold. And it was mixed together. It was all about God and gold. And so this is, and since the Portuguese and the Spanish were both Catholics, when they were starting to compete for control of the different parts of the world, they had to go to the Pope in Rome to say, hey, Pope, help us out here. And the Pope said, sure, glad to do it. Okay, here's the line. Anything to the east of that line, you get Portugal. Anything to the west of that line, Spain. Thus, we have Brazil, which is Portuguese colony, and all of this was supposed to be Portuguese, and everything over here is Spanish. So the Caribbean and whatever lies to this side of it, which turned out to be Mexico and the rest of South America. At this point, we didn't know, right? The Portuguese had control of India and Southeast Asia. We don't know what's over here, and we don't know what's over there at this point. And so the Spanish arrive in Mexico, and they find this incredibly sophisticated civilization at Mexico City, which looked like this. It was a canal city, and it was very much a city. So it was a lot like Venice, and boats were used for navigation, and they had floating gardens. And when the Spanish come, they have, given that they need to bring Christianity and take back gold and silver, what they do is they build a Spanish city on top of the temple complex at the center of Mexico City. So what they're doing is they take these sacred sites, and it's not enough to leave them in place and just convert people to Christianity. They have to actually obliterate the architecture. So their job is to transform this deeply religious society into Christians. And so who are you going to call? The architects. And so the architects construct the cathedral not next to this, because that's, you kill two birds with one stone by pulling down the stones, using those stones to build the cathedral. So you dismantle what was there and you put something new there. And that's what you do. And you do it in Mexico City, you do it, and you build a Spanish city. And you do it throughout the colonial world. And then the Spanish created a system called they wrote the Laws of the Indies. And the Laws of the Indies say, here's how you lay out cities in the New World. First of all, identify the center by their religious structures and build a cathedral on top of the religious structures. So everything they did in Mexico City, they did throughout the Spanish Americas. Step one, dismantle the temple and use the stones to build a cathedral. Put a square out. Step two, put a square out front. Step three, create a gridded city that goes out from that central plaza. Place the palace of the governor, the overseers, put all the important institutional structures around that square, and use that urban structural system to dominate and control the local population. So when you're trying to convert entire civilizations to Christianity and use them as a labor force to extract gold and silver from the mines, this is what you do. You set up this. These are the examples of the centers of multiple cities, and there were hundreds of them. And there's all kinds, and then there's all kinds of architectural principles that are similar to what Vitruvius did in Roman cities, about which way is the wind blowing. It's the kind of site design discussion you had in first and second year in studio. And part of this system was a system of labor. It was called the encomienda system. And it basically established a hierarchy where a handful of European Spaniards could control the large population of laborers of the indigenous populations. And they could cultivate the land, they could mine minerals and wealth out of the mountains and take it to the port and send it back to Spain or Portugal, because the Portuguese had a similar system. And so the fundamental principle was to convert souls to Christianity and extract wealth. And this was the big operation. And so now I'm going to move very quickly. We don't have time. Here's a very vivid example of one of the cathedrals that was built on top of one of the largest temple complexes in the Americas. And it basically gets just hidden by a hill or mountain, and the church is constructed at the top of it. So the next stop here, so there was a whole period of colonial, the operation of cities as an instrument of colonial extraction and conversion that the Spaniards and the Portuguese implemented with great success between around 1500. Well, for 2 centuries or so after 1500, after Columbus. Columbus came in 1492. I'm just saying for convenience sake, 1500 more or less is when the Spanish and Portuguese conquest of the Americas set these forces in motion. The next wave, and I'm calling that colonial extraction, the next wave of, the next thing to happen is the English and the Dutch came up with their own system of colonial rule, which was very different from the Portuguese and Spanish model. And so it's important to remember this. Around 1500, the Portuguese and Spanish model starts. It's based on monarchy, the king, the royal funding of these expeditions to the Americas, and then the church support for conversion to Christianity and extraction of wealth. Around 1600, both the English and the Dutch simultaneously came up with this very different model, and we're going to look at the Dutch one specifically because it was far more successful. So around 1600, the Dutch and the English started to dominate the colonial trade, and so the Spanish starts to fade in terms of dominance because it turns out that royal monopoly money is limited. The Dutch and the English found a new mechanism for financing these colonial adventures. It was called the corporation. So this was the birth of the corporation. And the architecture of the corporation is important. So you have what, for all intents and purposes, is a shop house. This is a Chinese shop house as found in Malaysia, but actually throughout the port cities throughout Asia. As you'll see, as you walk down the street, it's one shop house after another. This is what happens behind that facade. There's a 5-foot way covered veranda. There's the entrance to the shop, and so this front hall is basically a store. It's a retail store. And behind that store, there are workplaces, and behind that, there's a home. The family lives upstairs, and in the back, there's likely to be kind of what, for all intents and purposes, is a factory. It's where things are produced. And so raw materials are brought in through the front door, things are produced back here, and brought up here for sale. And so this was basically the infrastructure of production on the Asian side. And the upper floors could also be used for storage of raw materials or manufactured goods. On the European side, when you go to Amsterdam, you will see these canal shop houses. And this is not a good depiction because it doesn't show the relationship to the canal. I'm always looking for a better section. It's very, very hard to find. But when you go to Amsterdam, notice all these shop houses, these canal shop houses, where you go down. There's always a factory component to it, so things are produced. There's a shop component. Things are sold. There's a residential component where family lives, but the most amazing part of the Dutch shop house is the storage, the warehouse part, where you store things up above. And so keep that in mind. This is the architecture on the Asian side of the trade routes, and this is the architecture on the European side of the trade routes. And the most remarkable thing is the capacity to store commodities in the Dutch shop house. It's really quite remarkable, and you can still see it when you go there. So this is another tiny country. Like, what business does Portugal have dominating the world? They're a tiny little backward country. Same thing with the Netherlands, Holland. What are they doing controlling the world? They're this tiny little country. Uh-oh. What do you say?
That's way too late.
Huh?
It's too late.
What's too late?
It's 49 minutes late.
Yes, it is.
Can you stay,
We're gonna go this time.
please?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
No, this is everybody.
Okay.
Okay. So the Dutch send their ships, again, this tiny, tiny little country, which started out just getting lumber and timber from Scandinavia. Their trade went from just there to then covering this. All of these green dots are Dutch colonial settlements, including right here. So this was a Dutch, New England, well, not New England, but New York was called New Amsterdam. And they had trade outposts throughout all of these places. And they would send ships. First of all, the key technology here was mapping. For centuries, the Europeans were all struggling to find the source of nutmeg and mace, which it's so small. It's basically 4 islands. So Europeans were nuts for nutmeg, mace, pepper, and cloves. These 4 spices, if you could get a trunk load of any of those spices and sell it in Europe, you could retire for life. It was so lightweight, and a tiny bit was worth a lot of money, and everybody wanted it. It was the primary status symbol of European society, was to have spices in their food. Your high school teachers might have said, since they didn't have refrigerators, they needed spices to preserve their foods. That's not true. They knew how to preserve foods then. They preserve them the same way now. You dry them, you salt the food, you dry the food, you remove the moisture. But these spices have no preservative powers. So that's a false lesson. So erase that, replace it with this, that it was just culturally significant to have spices in your food, and especially at the holidays. And so you would invite people over to your house, and you would proudly offer them this cooked meats with cloves in it, and they would go, "Oh, wow!" And it was important to perform this ritual and demonstrate that you were wealthy enough to access cloves, even if it was just for that one meal a year. Everybody had to have cloves. So it was one of these inelastic commodities. No matter how high the price went, the demand didn't change. that's called inelastic. Elastic is where when the price goes up, instead of eating burritos, you eat falafel. You know, it's you shift your behavior to go for the cheaper price. That's high elasticity. Cloves and nutmeg, mace and pepper, not elastic. So you could charge anything you wanted. And so they sent spies for centuries. They sent spies into the Muslim ports of Cairo and Constantinople and tried to figure out where these spices were coming from. The Portuguese traced it as far as the Malabar coast of India, and then the Dutch spy intercepted that map, and then sent his own ship, convinced these investors to finance a ship at great expense to go find the source of pepper, spice, cloves, and nutmeg. He got this far, he found out a little more information, and he got this far, and he turns out he was totally incompetent and kind of an arrogant jerk. And so the four ships that were sent, one ship returned. And so it was a total financial disaster. He had one pot of peppercorns given to him by a king on the island of Bali. And so it wasn't a total bust. They basically broke even because he brought one pot of peppercorns. Amazing. And so they were reluctant to send another ship, but they did. And they sent 4 ships. These 4 ships came back. They had a much more diplomatic captain. These 4 ships came back filled with nutmeg, cloves, mace, and pepper, and they paid 400% on the investment. So if the company, so every time an expedition was sent out, they would form a company, and that company would either go completely bankrupt and lose every cent, or come back return with a 4 times return on their investment. So if you gave $1,000, invested $1,000 in this expedition, you would get $4,000 profit. Whereas if you put in $1,000 to the first expedition, you would get your $1,000 back, maybe, and just because the peppercorn gift from the king of Bali. So it was a highly tricky, sketchy operation. Where's that? This is it. Until they invented this. This is a piece of paper that basically says the person whose name here, the holder of this paper, owns a share in the joint stock company of the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. And it means I'm not just investing in a single voyage, which might yield huge riches or make me bankrupt. I'm investing in 10 years worth of voyages. So if 1 out of 4, or if half the voyages end in utter disaster, all crew members lost, the ships are gone, everyone's dead, and then every other one succeeds and there's huge wealth to be gained, this evens out those gains and losses. So you end up with a significant financial gain at the end of 10 years. And so this is the invention of the joint stock company. It was all the rage. Everybody in Holland wanted a piece of the action. And so it released vast amounts of wealth. Actually much, much more wealth than was available to the Spanish or the Portuguese through the royal coffers. And so it took off, it went crazy. This is the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Well, it's the market. Some of the things they're trading are stock certificates, but some of the things are actual commodities. These guys are located at this pillar, and this is the pillar designated for the trading of lumber, for making ships or buildings. And anyone who wants to sell lumber, they gather at this column. Anyone who wants to buy lumber also comes to this column. No one is selling lumber anywhere else in the market. Nobody else is selling lumber anywhere else in the Netherlands. This is it. This is the one place where all the buyers and all the sellers of lumber gather. These guys are renting out the upper floors of the shop houses for storage space for the cloves and the nutmeg and the mace and the pepper. If you bought so much that your own shop house can't hold it, they will rent you. And nobody else is renting those spaces. You have to come to this column. So this is the original open market. Have you heard of open markets? It refers to the architecture of the Amsterdam market. And each column is a location where a different thing is bought and sold, and all buying and selling, all trading is occurring in that one place. So that has the benefit of producing extremely stable and reliable pricing that directly reflects the balance of supply and demand, because all the buyers are here and all the sellers are here. Whatever price is established by the negotiations of these guys, and they're all guys, is a stable, reliable price. So the negotiating would happen in the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, and every month they would type up price sheets of what the price that was established in this open market. And those price sheets would be sent throughout Europe. And the Amsterdam market, because it was the biggest market in Europe, set the prices for everything throughout Europe. And that's the power of open market trade. And the architecture was a key component of it. The entryway was controlled. If you're entering this market, you are agreeing no cussing, no spitting, no fisticuffs. That's an old-fashioned way of saying no fighting. You had to be a man. You had to be an adult. No dogs, no children, no women. But we welcome Muslim traders because they're part of our trade network. We welcome people from North Africa. We welcome traders of all races and nationalities because they're part of our international network. This is globalization in the 16th century. This is from 1612, so the 17th century. 17th century is when this is. And so the architecture is at the core of this whole thing. It's also significant that it's located on the main canal in Amsterdam. It's not there anymore, but you can go see, you will walk through this square, the Damrak Square in Amsterdam. It's located here because this is where the original fish market was. And the boats would pull up, they would have fish in it, and at the market they would say, hey, I'm selling fish. And the buyer would say, what fish? And the seller would say, those fish over there in the boat, over there at the quay. Remember, how do you spell quay? Q-U-A-Y. Yeah, but it's pronounced quay. And that's this thing. That boat over there on the quay has the fish in it. You can go check it out if you want. And the buyer says, I trust you. If the boat with the fish in it weren't right there, he would say, I think I need to see the fish, or he would say, I'm not interested. But because the boat has the fish in it, he knows that there's accountability, he knows that he could go check it, there's no need to. And that is the basis of trust that was fundamental in the stock program. And if you pull out a dollar bill and you look at it, it says, in God we trust. It's guaranteed by the Federal Reserve. It's the same thing as today. It's the establishment of trust based on the fact that there's a long history of the fish being high quality, of these stock certificates being trusted, of the dollar bill being worth more or less $1. Based on that precedent, based on that history of success in trusting relationships, we trust. It's not so much in God, it's more like we trust in the reliability of the system for this dollar bill to hold its value. And it's based again on the architectural arrangement of the market next to the place where the goods would come and go, the main port of Amsterdam. And down below here, these are warehouses. So you could unload your goods and store them below the market. So just in case you wanted to check the quality of the pepper and make sure it didn't get wet, you can go right downstairs and check the quality of the pepper. But 99 times out of 10, out of 100, you don't bother because there's the establishment of trust. This is the foundation of capitalism. It's trusting in paper negotiations. So again, here's the main port of Amsterdam. Here's the fish market that became the commodity market, not just for fish, but for corn, wheat, barley, everything else. And here's the Amsterdam exchange that is also part of this system. The boats can actually go underneath this bridge-like structure and unload their goods into the warehouse, and so that all the exchange is happening. So the architectural arrangement, the formal spatial institutional arrangement of Amsterdam is such that the goods come and go here. The marketplaces are right there where the goods can be inspected. Whether they're inspected or not is another question. But because of the proximity of the goods coming in and going out and the marketplaces of exchange, that's how this whole system operates. In addition to that, the Wache is basically the weights and measures administration. They guarantee that a kilogram of fish is a kilogram of fish. And again, the location is crucial. If you're buying fish here or you're buying corn and you say, that doesn't look like a kilogram of corn, the merchant can say, there's the weights and measure, and here's the guy who guarantees it. So it's the formal spatial institutional arrangement is crucial to the establishment of trust. If the Bureau of Weights and Measures was in the next city or in the next neighborhood, that relationship of trust would not be as strong. And then finally, the town hall of Amsterdam, which is also the location of the Wisselbank, which is the merchant's bank. So anytime there was a certificate that has value, you could exchange it here freely, and anytime you want, you can walk over to the Wisselbank and cash it in, and for gold or something else. And so the proximity, the location of this on the central square of Amsterdam was crucial to the establishment of trust. And the East India Company was right over here. And so these institutions at the core of Amsterdam is really the architecture of trust at the core of the first capitalist center of global exchange.
I think that also based on the trust, that's the time when they came up with insurance system.
Yes, insurance is very much a part of this. That's more a story of England, which I'm not sure we're going to get to that. But in England, it was the coffee houses. Lloyd's of London was formed in the coffee shops of England because drinking coffee, not just at Starbucks, right? Drinking coffee was where people got together and socialized, and it's where sailors and merchants would say, hey, I hear that ship sank off the coast of Cuba. Too bad they lost all their cargo. And so the insurance business formed in the coffee houses based on the information flows in coffee houses. Not coincidentally, when people try to replicate Silicon Valley, the genius of Hewlett-Packard, Microsoft, the whole Palo Alto Silicon Valley miracle, at the core of that miracle is not just Stanford University, it's also the main street of Palo Alto, and the coffee shops there, the exchange of information. And if you go to the main street of Palo Alto now, there's all kinds of WeWork type work share spaces where the importance of being physically, bodily present at the core of innovation is everything. And coffee is also consumed. So if there's something about coffee and the spaces that develop around coffee, and there are entire courses taught about the architecture and economics, global economics of coffee, that some friends of mine have written that are very interesting. So here's Amsterdam. Here's the key institutions at the core of Amsterdam. And the key, all of those relationships expand out to the canal city of Amsterdam, because those goods and commodities that are being exchanged are stored in the attics of all the shop houses. This is what has become the Jordaan, which is where you're going to hang out when you go to Amsterdam. This is like everybody's favorite place. But it developed because of the flow of goods from the Spice Islands, the Dutch East Indies, which is now called Indonesia, and Amsterdam. It was 20,000 kilometer trade network that built the cities on both sides. So this is more about all of that. We're going to jump forward to Batavia. These are all the this is underneath the Amsterdam Exchange. This is the canal, and these are the storehouses on the canal. This is the document I found in the archives that said what things are being sold at what column. And you can actually see, you can compare this documentation from the archives in Amsterdam with this portrait and determine who's selling what. It's very interesting stuff.
So that building doesn't exist anymore?
Does not exist anymore. But there are buildings like it all over the world. The Dutch East India Company. So here, when you go to Amsterdam, you'll see that the upper floors of a lot of buildings have these hoistways there, and that was so they could, on the canal, they could lift the bundles of goods directly up to the storage areas in the top of these shop houses. They now use it for moving furniture. You can't move furniture up and down these narrow, very, very steep stairways. So when you move house in Amsterdam, everything goes in and out through the windows. And so this trade between Amsterdam and the Spice Islands created a boom, and they quickly had to expand Amsterdam out to the Jordaan. This is in 1662, and they kept expanding 1688, and the Herengracht. Let's move forward, skip the Tulip Mania. If you watch Wall Street, which was a great movie, they talk about how markets operate, and Michael Douglas is pointing out what happened in the Netherlands with Tulip Mania. Have you heard of Tulip Mania? Anyone? You've heard of it? What is it?
Yeah. It's like where there's just sort of like a craze of just like tulips, the flowers, so like everyone just bought like as much tulips as they could like get their hands on, and then eventually it like crashed.
Yeah. Basically, it was a bubble. So you guys were alive, right, in 2007 when the U.S. experienced a bubble that burst. It was a bubble in the housing market in the United States. This was the original famous bubble that everybody refers to. Was a single bulb, a single tulip bulb, was what? Bid up in price till it was the equivalent value of 12 acres of land. Crazy. One bulb. Back then, you could buy 12 acres of land, or you could buy one tulip bulb. Until everyone said, until people said, "I'm not going to pay that," and then crashed. Just like housing prices in 2007. So the same thing was happening. So whatever was happening to build Amsterdam was happening on the other side of the world, in Batavia, which is now called Jakarta, Indonesia. Batavia, East Indies, was the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company in Asia. All the spices were coming in here, all the pepper was coming in here, and then from here it was sent. The ships from here would go here. So this, if we saw ships here, they'd be, if we could read the writing, we'd see they're the same ships. Same ships in both port, same basic urban strategy for formation. This one started more organically because of the River I was here, and that's why the fishermen chose this location to settle. But this was a fishing port also that in 1629 the Dutch East India Company said, okay, we're going to destroy this fishing village, burn it to the ground, kill everybody, and take over and make it the site of our headquarters. So they reproduced the Dutch canal city in Southeast Asia, and it's based on this theoretical urban design of the era. But both cities are basically based on this ideal fortified canal city form. You had to defend it against competition. In Batavia, they were able to come closer to the ideal form because they were starting more or less from scratch. And so it's a really interesting, and there's a lot of portraits that show the cast of characters that gather at, this is the Waag, this is the Stadthouse, the old church, the fish market, the quay here, and the Amsterdam Exchange is just off to the right. And we know who each one of these people is supposed to represent. And there are some people from India, some people from Constantinople, some people from the surrounding European civilizations. There's a Spaniard trader showing that even though the Dutch are at war with Spain, trade has to go on. Sure, we're at war with them, but we're not crazy. We still have to trade, right? So there's money to be made even though we're at war. The same thing in Batavia. The same painter does the same thing in Batavia. And we see the Chinese trader, the Mardiker, who is from Malacca. We know who all these people are. The Javanese woman and the Dutch man. The symbol of prestige is the umbrella being held by a servant from behind. We know who all these people are. And it's not, the reason the people figure so prominently is because this painting has to perform a very specific job. This painting is in Amsterdam, in the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company, overlooking in the room of the conference room where the masters, the trustees of the company, of the corporation, have their meetings. If they were responsible overseers of the Dutch East India Company, they would be visiting here every month or so and to check on the operations. But who's got time for that? It takes 2 months to get there, and there's a lot of malaria, a lot of people die. Let's just look up on the wall and be reassured that everything is going fine. We have all the people in the trade network, we have the local marketplace, we have the main canal where the goods come in and out, we have the fortification that defends our interests in Southeast Asia, we have the local governor is going on his inspection tour, we have the gallows where we hang people, we have the penitentiary just prominently displayed. So we're keeping order in the kingdom. We don't have to visit, we just look up at the painting that's on the wall over our meeting place. And so this is, it's similar to our analysis, right? It's a slightly elevated point of view. We have access to the people in the foreground, the architectural scale human experience. We have the formal spatial arrangement of the market, the factory, the shipbuilding operations, the fortifications, the governor, the gallows and the penitentiary, the canal infrastructure, the goods coming on and off the boat. It's basically doing the same thing as our analysis projects, our Wednesday analysis projects. Same principles at work, but here to reassure us that the operation of the multinational corporation, the Dutch East India Company, the first and largest in history, the first and largest multinational corporation in history, that everything's going well. So they're doing the same thing at both ends of the trade network. Okay. And just to check in on one of the themes of the course, in Batavia we have the different areas for the Dutch officers, a handful of Dutch officers, a lot of Chinese merchants and overseers, and then the vast population of port workers with military command posts and control points, so that the movement through this part of the city is highly orchestrated and controlled. In South Africa, you had to pull out your pass and say, my employer has put a pass in my passbook, I can go into the white neighborhood to work as long as I leave before dark. Here, they didn't have to pull out a passbook because they had laws about what you could and could not wear. And so these paintings, one of the role of these paintings is to categorize humans, to make sure we're clear on the status of every single individual. So these paintings also work as a catalog of who people are. In the Dutch Quarter, we put the name of every single person who occupies this block. We know where they live exactly. And that's for the Dutch population and the wealthy Chinese. But for the workers, we say who are the overseers of the vast population of workers. And each category of workers are required to wear a certain costume to identify who they are and whether or not they can pass through the checkpoints at the bridges. London. So the London East India Company had a similar relationship with Calcutta and cities throughout India and elsewhere. The British Empire was the last to go away, and they had massive coverage. So here's another example of before photography, the importance of the kind of views that we're working with in our Wednesday analysis assignments. It's a slightly elevated view. It gives you access to human scale architectural experience in the foreground in relationship to the larger system of the urban fabric. And the message of this system is St. Paul's Cathedral overlooks everything. And the neighborhood churches are maintaining the piety of the people. And outside of London, there is a bucolic agricultural pastoral landscape that is in good balance between the ethical, moral society of English society and the good hard work of the working English. And this is a similar one that starts to inventory the churches, first and foremost. So you will recall that class that we had last summer. Where is that? It's later. I should have put that here. So we'll get to that part soon. So London in 1666 had a devastating fire, and it burned down the heart of London. That's horrible. And you remember the topic last week of these visual axes like at Versailles. They had lots of ideas about how to rebuild London after the fire. And so you have all these proposals which basically are an inventory of the big ideas of how cities should be designed at the time. Well, the constraints of land ownership restricted what they could do to rebuild London, and so they had to stick with the old property lines And so they rebuilt it more or less the same as it was before the fire. The next thing that happened is that these large noble houses, under housing pressure, became the centers of these residential neighborhoods. So one after another, these royal, palaces of the minor nobility became residential squares all over London. So that's a really interesting pattern that you can still see in London today. This is a data visualization and information design showing the trade of coal with the rest of the world. England became a source of coal, and this was at the dawn of steam power, and so they were taking this coal all over the world. So it's a really interesting depiction that gives us a sense of the trade networks of the British Empire. And they said that the sun never sets on the British Empire because they had enclaves all over the world, not just India and South Africa, but Canada and South America, Australia, New Zealand, just everywhere. And when you studied the Industrial Revolution in high school and before, the part that they probably neglected was the connection between the Industrial Revolution and colonialism. So the raw materials that were fed into the English industrial system were coming from all over the world. And they were going from England factories to the rest of the world. So they were being sold back to people all over the world. And the first wave of the Industrial Revolution of England was based on the technological innovations of water power. And so they located factories at fast-moving streams wherever there was a significant drop in the water level, and that's where they had access to water power. It was also a location where they had access to transportation. So the river system of England was used both for powering the factories and for transporting raw resources to the factory and manufactured resources away from the factory. Here's the image you will recall from this last summer, where a similar depiction of the good city of England dominated by churches and a pastoral landscape, again, architectural scale, human experience in the foreground, larger urban system in the distance. And Pugin was making a rhetorical point. He was saying, back in the old days, 1440, we were moral and ethical, and we had a peaceful relationship with each other and the landscape. Now, with the Industrial Revolution, we have this horrible, wretched existence where the steeples are broken off and competing with the smokestacks. We have a panopticon penitentiary in the foreground, a poorhouse, and so he's using this analytical, elevated view, similar for rhetorical purposes. We can't verify his assertion because it's a drawing, it's not a photograph. It's not valid photographic evidence. Similarly, the depictions of cities throughout this era depict the kind of conditions that we read about in the reading, with horrible polluted water systems filled with stench, crowded streets, smoky air blocking out the sun even on the sunniest day, these steam locomotives spewing soot into the landscape, these factory buildings spilling their effluents into the water supply. And depictions like this by Gustave Doré, where you would wash your white clothes, you'd hang them up to dry, and before they would dry, they'd be so covered with soot that they'd be dirty again before they even got dry. And the overcrowding being depicted here, again, the smoke spewing, steam locomotive, just horrible conditions. This is not so different from what was replicated in New England. So the conditions of England, the next generation of that in New England. How many of you grew up in New England? So, did you live near a mill town? Like, what mill towns were you near?
Well, Lincoln, Rhode Island.
Lincoln, Rhode Island, yeah.
Lowell.
Lowell, yeah. We're going to see Lowell. Any others? It's a good analysis exercise to look at. So after Engels published his piece in 1844, he published it without any images, and we didn't have photography quite yet. So people started to make these maps to give power and authority to the writing that Engels was providing. And here in red we see the shopping. This is the retail along the major shopping streets, and then behind that facade of retail splendor are the dark slums that Engels is describing for us. And so here's the visualization that goes with Engels' writing. And so we have both the artist depicting those horrible conditions and the analytical graphic depictions of the maps. This is the famous John Snow's famous Broad Street pump cholera map. It was thought that cholera and other diseases spread through the air. And if you could smell bad smells, you were exposing yourself to illness. And so when the River Thames, which is the river that runs through London, was stagnant, it filled up with sewage, and they had to cancel Parliament because the stench was coming in through the windows. Even though they soaked the curtains in lime bleach to stop it, they were terrified that they were all going to get cholera because they could smell the River Thames. Well, John Snow in 1854 said, it's not so much the smell, it's the water supply. And so he did this data visualization where to test his theory, he documented the number of deaths by cholera in this neighborhood. And he noticed that the closer you were to Broad Street, the more likely you were to die of cholera. He took this to the local council, and it was so convincing that they gave him the authority to remove the pump handle on the Broad Street pump right there. And this was the conclusive demonstration of the argument that cholera was being spread through the water supply, not the air. But still, our reform of the factory system and the housing that is associated with the factory system was based on the provision of light and air to every room. And thus, still, to this day, the codes require us to have access to light and air. We have to have windows in every occupied room of a residence except bathrooms and closets. And that's why buildings look the way they look. And you did that housing thing, right? Remember that housing thing you did? Did you learn about this then? Did you learn about the window requirements of the building code? Okay. So here are some of those mill towns of the area. And the geometries that you can see, people use purple because that's the official color for industry. But see how soft the purple is? Isn't that nice? It's so nice and soft, so nice and transparent. Sometimes there are still rail lines, and sometimes there are not. But there's recognizable rail geometries that are legible in these patterns of urban. And so this is a really interesting analysis that shows us the evidence of rail infrastructure based solely on the fact that the orientation of buildings are such that it's highly likely that these geometries were caused by the location of rail lines. And after the rail lines are no longer relevant and they transport everything by truck, you can build on top of those rail lines and basically erase those geometries. It's a very interesting study, exploration of those geometries. And the housing is over here, separated from the factories, but not far away. Similarly, housing in yellow, commercial in red, industrial in purple. Here's a canal. Here's the drop in the, I think it's the Merrimack River. And you pull the water from the upstream side, you keep it dead flat. And as the river drops down and this stays dead flat, you can then send that water through these buildings and power the factories. And you just keep it going. The further downstream you go, the more power is available, because water weighs 8 pounds a gallon, and that 8 pounds dropping 10 feet is half as much energy as those 8 pounds dropping 20 feet. And that's how you power the factories. And these geometries are available all over. So the conditions, we looked at some of this. This is the illustration that came out to support Engels' writing. They studied where people slept and the arrangements of those back alleys that you were reading about. This is the piecework industry where you do the work near the window, where you had access to light. Jacob Riis was the photographer who followed Engels 60 years later, was able to take photographs of the conditions that Engels was writing about. We looked at some of this stuff. So this is Jacob Riis's photography of New York City. If you saw Gangs of New York, that's what they were looking at. So basically, because you've already done housing, and we've talked about it in the other class, it's really all about finding housing types where the individual units have access to light and air, and always trying to increase the amount of light and air available to every room in the housing arrangement. And that drives the design of each individual unit. But as you design each individual unit, as you found out last fall, you have to also be aware of the design of the building. And I'm just reminding you that it's not just the design of the unit and the building, but the design of the building has a huge impact on the streets, the streetscapes, and the city that it produces. And so you have, remember this, you go from the old tenement laws to the new public housing, where the access to light and air is taken to the extreme, where you have these object buildings in the center of the lot, the tower in the park idea of Corbusier, and now we've just connected to stuff we've studied last week. Okay? Cool? And in your careers, what you'll notice is that we have multifamily dwellings, we have single-family houses, but the demand that is not being satisfied in most places throughout the United States is that middle zone that is somewhere between multifamily dwellings, large footprint multifamily dwellings, and the single-family house. This is a very important middle zone where most housing demand lies, but housing supply has been artificially prevented from filling in that because of parking regulations, because of the difficulty of finance, and all kinds of different distortions of market forces that don't allow developers and architects and builders to satisfy the market demands of that missing middle segment of the housing market. And so your careers have a lot to do with addressing